Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to this symposium on policies related to psychedelic substances. My name is Andrew Lewis. I'm the Seattle City Council member representing District 7. Before we get into the substance of this conversation and introduce our illustrious panel, I want to give a few brief introductory remarks and just say a little background before we get into the presentation this afternoon. I want to start by stating that I didn't really know a whole lot about policies surrounding natural psychedelics and entheogens at the beginning of this year. And in the spring, I had the great privilege of meeting with a lot of folks from Decriminalized Nature Seattle to talk about the policy, to talk about various specific entheogens and naturally occurring substances, and the medical research being done to examine the potential of these substances to have a big impact in our community and the community writ large. And since that time, I've met with clinicians and scientists about the potential for treating substance addiction and behavioral mental health conditions with entheogen-based treatments. I've met with community members who have lost loved ones who could have benefited from these treatments and who are advocates for a liberalization of policies around entheogens and psychedelics. And my hope is that this symposium is going to allow this discourse that my office and I have been engaged in to benefit the entire community, to hear from the individuals today who I've talked to about these topics and this subject and the policy, the status of the science and the medical research. And we'll just highlight that Seattle is a fairly latecomer to this conversation. Denver, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Oakland, California, and the entire state of Oregon, among other jurisdictions, have to varying degrees liberalized their policy around these substances due to some of the potential that they have to make a really significant difference in clinical and medical settings. So today, we're taking one step further in joining this national conversation. And with that, I'm truly honored to introduce our panel and really excited to get into this discussion. I'm going to introduce folks one by one, let them give a brief introduction, and then I will, in the Zoom popcorning on tradition, I will queue up the next person to give an introduction, and then we will go through the entire panel for presentations, and then leave time for audience questions and have a little bit of back and forth among panel members in terms of next steps and what the future might hold in this field. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Nathan Sackett of the University of Washington Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Doctor, take it away for a brief introduction.
Yeah, hi, happy to be here. My name is Dr. Nathan Sackett. I am an addiction psychiatrist at the University of Washington. I split my time doing research and doing direct patient care, both in addictions and general psychiatry. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Next panelist I want to introduce is Dr. Sunil Agrawal, co-director of the Ames Institute. Doctor, take it away.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis. Hello, I'm Sunil Agrawal. I am a physician, and my specialties are hospice and palliative medicine and physical medicine and rehabilitation. So I have a special interest in the care of patients who are chronically, seriously, and terminally ill. And I practice at the Ames Institute in Seattle, where we do Advanced Integrative Medical Science Institute. That's what it stands for. And we do some psychedelic assisted therapies that are legal, like ketamine. And and I'm also on faculty at the University of Washington as a courtesy. So it's great to be here with all of you.
Thank you for joining us. Next up, Dr. Mason Marks.
Thank you so much for having me and for hosting this event. I'm Mason Marks. I'm a law professor. For the past 2 years, I've taught constitutional law and health law at Gonzaga University, recently moved to the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law. I'm also a senior fellow at Harvard Law School, where I lead the project on psychedelics law and regulation, or POPLAR. I'm a member of the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board, which is making recommendations to the Oregon Health Authority regarding psilocybin regulation. And I practice law with the firm Harris Bricken, which has offices in Seattle and Portland in the Pacific Northwest.
Thank you so much. And then next panelist I want to queue up here, Todd Youngs.
Yeah, hi, Councilman. My name is Todd Youngs. I am a recovering addict, transforming human being. I am a recovery coach, and I work intensely with others with their problems. And I'm definitely a true believer in the life-restoring power of psychedelics. Quite simply, without them, I would not be here. And so I'm honored to be here to share. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Monique Bridges.
Hello, everyone. My name is Monique, and I'm co-chair of education and outreach for DNS. And I'm also the project lead for the SHARP project. And I'm a mom of 4 beautiful sons.
Great,
so I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And then Tatiana Quintana.
Hi, thank you. I'm really honored to be here today. So my name is Tatiana Quintana. I am co-director of Decrim Nature Seattle. I'm also co-chair of education and outreach with Monique. The bulk of what I really care about doing is increasing access for folks to psychedelics for their personal well-being, and particularly thinking about that through an equity lens. Thank you.
Thank you. And then John Rapp.
Thanks, Andrew. My name is John Rapp. I'm a trial lawyer here in Seattle. I've been involved with Decriminalized Nature Seattle, along with other people on this symposium. And I think that plant medicines can do an awful lot to help our city heal. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. All right, so we're going to begin the symposium today by deep diving a little bit more with our first 2 panelists, Dr. Sackett and Dr. Agrawal. So Dr. Sackett, why don't we start with you with your presentation, and then we will continue down the agenda. So take it away, please.
Great, thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about psychedelics and their possible use to the treatment of substance use disorders. And again, my name is Nathan Sackett. I'm an addiction psychiatrist. So that means that I treat people with co-occurring psychiatric disorders and substance use disorders. And as you can imagine, the treatments that we currently have are profoundly limited. And it was about halfway through my training that I began to hear stories from patients who were using psychedelic and plant-based medicines to treat their substance use disorders with profound results. And it was quite moving. And that led me to reach out to meet actually a lot of my co-panelists here and explore this topic in more detail, and ultimately led me to the career that I have now as an addiction psychiatrist who also does research in this area. So let me just briefly talk about psychedelics and addiction. So first, when we talk about psychedelics, I want to be very clear that when I use the word psychedelics, I'm talking about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. This is not anyone going to some party on Friday night and taking a bunch of substances of unknown origin. This is a very intentional and organized practice where someone takes psychedelics with a therapist. They have preparatory sessions, they have the session with the therapist, and then they have what are called integration sessions. And it's in this structured environment where we have seen over the years profound results, particularly for substance use disorders. And in fact, this has been going on really since the 1950s. First with alcohol use was some of the early studies that were done. And it was through these early studies in the 1950s that it was noted that psychedelics can be catalysts for profound behavioral change. And that's the key here, that these substances, they work to motivate and to catalyze change and engagement in behavioral treatments. They're not a magic bullet, but they certainly can accelerate the care. And I've seen this firsthand with lots of different people. So let me just give 2 quick examples to, I think, highlight some of the numbers. Oftentimes, physicians like myself throw around numbers and it can seem pretty overwhelming. But I want to first talk a little bit about alcohol use disorder. Alcohol use disorder is one of the most difficult things that I see because it's so pervasive. so culturally normative, and yet so incredibly destructive. Now, for context, the first line medication that I use when I see someone from a pharmacologic perspective is a medicine called naltrexone. It's a great medicine. It works quite well. The number needed to treat when I treat someone with naltrexone is 33. Number needed to treat, what that means is I need to see 33 patients that are all similar. I need to give them naltrexone every day, and they need to take it correctly. Out of that 33, I will see one positive outcome. And in this case, a positive outcome is someone not drinking. So that's actually pretty good in my line of work in terms of the efficacy of a medicine. Studies have looked at things like LSD historically for alcohol use disorder. And the number needed to treat for alcohol use disorder with one treatment of LSD is 7. That is a profound difference than the standard of care that we currently have using naltrexone. And there's been some follow-up studies that have looked at other similar substances. Bogenschultz in 2016 did a study where he took 10 alcohol use patients, gave them 3 psilocybin sessions, and at 12 weeks, there was a 50% reduction in alcohol use. Again, these numbers in my line of work are profound. My last example is with tobacco. Tobacco is similar, it's a huge public health issue. We see it everywhere. It's incredibly hard to quit. And in 2014, a study out of Johns Hopkins took 15 smokers and gave them psilocybin. And at the end of their treatment, when it was combined with a behavioral intervention, 12 of the 15 of the participants had stopped smoking at 6 months. They did a follow-up study. At a year, 10 of those 15 patients remained abstinent from tobacco. Again, these numbers are staggering that I don't ever see in any other medicine that I have available in psychedelics. So I'm just about out of time, and I'm just gonna wrap it up by saying that psychedelics are profoundly safe when they're given in a controlled environment with skilled professionals. They clearly act both on a physiologic level and on a psychologic level. And there's growing evidence to suggest that they can have a profound impact to motivate change for substance use disorders, which is obviously a huge public health concern of mine. And on that, I will pass it on. And if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sackett. That was incredibly informative, and I'm sure there will be additional questions as we go through the symposium today. So Dr. Agrawal, why don't we move on to your presentation, and then maybe we could take a moment to, I know I definitely have a few follow-up questions from Dr. Sackett's presentation, and maybe we can sort of lump you guys together a little bit for questions as a panel before we move on to our next few folks who are with us this afternoon. So Dr. Agrawal, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon again. So I just want to spend my time today in the symposium doing some additional education to share the what information I've learned and gathered in my own training and studies related to how people with different forms of different conditions, and I'm going to tell you a few, can benefit from psychedelic substances or entheogens, depending on what term you want to use. Entheogen is sort of a term that connotes the history of these substances in spiritual traditions around the world. And so what I'll do is actually focus my comments on three therapeutic potentials in 3 areas. One is palliation of end-of-life care needs, patients, so seriously ill, terminally ill patients. One is the potential for psychedelic assistance to assist in brain injury rehabilitation, nervous system and brain injury rehabilitation after trauma. The third is alleviation of pain. And then if there's time, I'm also, in addition to a physician, I have a doctorate in medical geography. And so I'm really interested in the public health approach that we take. And there's a concept in what does it mean for a public health system to recognize the spiritual health and safety of entheogens? And I want to talk about that perspective briefly and introduce the concept of eco-cultural identity, which is an important part of people's identity to, the term decriminalized nature. Why nature, and what does nature have to do with our identities? So let's begin by talking a little bit about some of the Dr. Sackett alluded to some of the recent research, older and recent research studies. And in the same way, the use of psychedelic substances to alleviate symptoms of serious distress and end-of-life situations of patients has been looked at again since the 60s, 50s and 60s, very early on. And there are reports from doctors who are administering this from like at University of Chicago or in the LA area, describing the significant relief that patients who were facing mortality, like serious mortality diagnosis, like advanced cancer, how it could help them prepare for what death, the process of letting go might be like, so that when that time does come, which will come for all of us, they were more prepared. And the time between when they took that session and met their end, they had a chance to have a better quality of life. Now, those were the early studies, and this sort of came fast forward to like the 2000s and after the turn of the century. So because of the bans, it was very hard to do this work, but researchers at UCLA, Johns Hopkins, NYU, at least in the US, really took these steps to actually like start to apply the modern trials in patients with advanced cancer. And these studies are all very, very impressive. Then these patients with advanced cancer in randomized controlled fashion. So sometimes they got psilocybin, sometimes they got placebo. They were all, like Dr. Sackett was saying, where they were screened, they were prepared, they went through a structured process. But they were all people that were suffering from significant life-threatening or terminal conditions. These patients had significant alleviation of symptoms of psychospiritual distress. I'm going to list some of those terms for you. So things like a change in spiritual well-being, a change in quality of life, death acceptance, life meaning, optimism, and spiritual meaning. And these are various validated scales that look at these. And there's another concept that we use called demoralization, just the sense of like just hopelessness and that patients often can face when they get these kind of diagnoses and undergo these treatments. So furthermore, many of the research studies also tried to kind of further substantiate how is this happening, and also how long do these effects last. And in some of the cases where patients who are still alive with a condition, like some of these lasting effects would go on for 1 year. And then, the research study has to end, they run out of money or something, but I'm sure like we have data that goes 12 months longitudinally in patients like this. So that's quite significant to see those kind of enduring changes. And sometimes the sessions, there's a few sessions, not just one session, but sometimes it could be just one. So that just gives you a sense of what the potential is in palliative care and end-of-life care and hospice care, where many, many patients struggle with these kind of existential issues and depression and anxiety. And we are currently working, I work through the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Care, which is an international organization, the largest one. They have a psychedelic assisted therapy specialty group forum where a lot of folks in the field are focused on that. And we're working on a right to try effort at our clinic with the assistance of the Washington State Attorney General's office to try and secure access to psilocybin under the right to try laws, which exist to help exactly patients who are with serious or terminal illness. So those are the ways in which, in addition to this, we're trying to implement these clinical studies and make it more of an operational thing. And anyway, I won't have, but just sort of know, I think the issue, the way it works is probably through allowing greater cognitive flexibility and helping to de-pattern certain types of default conditioning that comes up. It's a trauma model. So, I think there's a lot of overlap between the psychiatric and the palliative. And then just to touch briefly on the brain injury issue. So my colleagues and I recently published a paper in the Frontiers of Neurology journal reviewing some of the studies that are looking at psychedelics for the use in brain injury. And there's quite a lot of that research is in the early stages, I would certainly say, in terms of like, actual human clinical studies. But there are plenty of folks around who can give you anecdotes, stories of significant brain injuries that they were able to alleviate with their own self-directed or some kind of guided use of psychedelic substances that they were obtained on the underground. And that's really a remarkable thing. When you have certain brain injuries, people are impaired for life, cognitively disabled, unable to work, unable to function, executive function impairment. So it seems like psychedelics have some kind of anti-inflammatory role in the brain. And that our body actually produces a chemical called DMT, which is one of the psychedelic substances that is being discussed. And that's actually naturally occurring, and it might be involved in anti-inflammatory effects in the brain. So more to come on that work, but there's a lot of centers already looking at it and planning clinical trials, also for stroke. So, who's to say this could also be married with a therapeutic model as well, a psychotherapeutic model too. So the third area is pain. And phantom limb pain in particular, there's been some published case reports out of UC San Diego showing patients with severe pain after amputation of a limb. This is where the brain really doesn't understand that this part of the body is no longer there. And then there's a feedback issue. And so patients do what's called mirror therapy, which sometimes helps. I don't know the number needed to treat, but it's, it is not always effective, but it helps a little. But there was a patient who used mirror therapy and also used psilocybin, again, not obtained through the doctors at the research hospital, but the doctors at the research hospital were so impressed with his relief of using mirror therapy and psilocybin that they wrote up his case, and he described in very much detail exactly how much he took. So we know from those case reports that, and then there's some work out of Switzerland showing LSD at low doses can assist in alleviation of experimentally induced pain due to really, really cold temperatures. So there is definitely something going on with the pain system, and psychedelic substances helping to lower raise the threshold or change the way the body processes pain. This is very important in the epidemic of an undertreated pain that we face today, and alternatives beyond opioids. Finally, I'll just make a brief mention about this, the public health approach. I just wanted to say that I believe that these psychedelic substances, entheogens, are in many ways cultures have developed long-standing relationships with them, and which are in part tied to their relationship to the natural world. So you can look at indigenous North American or South American indigenous traditions of reverence of certain sacred plants that revere as sacred. And it's the same sort of sacredness that the Catholic Church might revere the communion wine. And I think it's important for us to, as a society, to recognize that in our history of colonialism and dominant ideologies, we may have destroyed or undercut a sacred relationship that is well documented historically and exists today. And it's not just in indigenous communities. I think all of us have an identity relationship to our place in our culture. It's an ecocultural identity. It's a new concept in the social sciences literature that I think will help us stitch together all the other axes of identity, whether it's class, race, ethnicity, gender, et cetera, sexual orientation. All of these things are important in the city of Seattle. The language is very important, and disability, ability, all of that is very important and makes the city a safer place. And I believe recognizing this spiritual dimension will also assist in that as far as the identity, respecting people's identity in the city. So those are my comments for this for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for really setting the table here with a lot of really important observations about the state of research and studies showing a lot of this potential impact. I think one of the comments that Dr. Agrawal just made regarding the potential with further research of some of these substances being opioid alternatives for pain relief is certainly a very interesting and attractive given the scale and scope of a lot of the issues we've seen over the last 15 years as a nation and longer around opioid dependence and the proliferation of opioid addiction. So I want to kind of go back to Dr. Sackett for just a moment. And then if other panelists have a few more questions for both of you before we move to the next panel of folks, just to talk a little bit about that intersection around addiction treatment for opioids or for other substances, and how psychedelics could interact in that area. And I wonder, has there been research on the potential of psychedelics more broadly on substances like methamphetamine addiction or anything else in that field? Just given that, as a nation, we continue to really suffer from a lot of substance dependency, and that's been a big area of interest in this topic for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are very good questions. And these are questions that I continuously have as well. Obviously, the opiate pandemic is something, that we're all struggling with. And it's obviously, I would love to see a psychedelic be able to help with that. And there has been some interesting preliminary data to suggest that psychedelics can have a profound impact. There's some interesting literature looking at ayahuasca as a possible catalyst or a possible treatment for opiate use disorder. There has been some interesting preliminary data looking at psilocybin for opiate use disorder. For stimulants, it's the data. I'm not as familiar with that data. If anyone else is familiar with it, please speak up. But there's not a lot of good data, as far as I can tell, from stimulants per se. There's a couple of good studies on looking at ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for cocaine use disorder. There's 2 good studies that have recently been done that are showing some exciting results. The state of the data is all pretty young, and so it's hard to generalize. I think honestly, the more powerful story here is hearing from people who have used and struggled with addiction, people like Todd and other panelists who have firsthand experience. But from a data perspective, there's certainly promise. There's some noise there that I'm really excited about. And I certainly want to see more research very soon. I think, it's a public health imperative. Is that I know that's kind of an evasive answer to your question, but does that sort of address it?
No, I'm a politician. I'm used to evasive questions. It's perfectly fine. But no, I thought that was great. And I thought it did directly answer my question. I didn't find it evasive. Do panelists have any other?
I just wanted to throw in one more additional point to that, if you don't mind, Councilmember. Just the psilocybin has been shown in clinical studies by Matthew Johnson and his team to assist in the tobacco nicotine dependence, which is also a very difficult to treat addiction. So I just wanted to add that bright silver lining.
No, I appreciate that. I'm definitely in the silver lining business for sure. So how about this? Let's move on to just to make sure we keep the presentation moving. But if there's other comments that come up, to circle back to the presentations of Dr. Sackett and Dr. Agrawal, there will definitely be another opportunity to jump in for them to respond. So I want to turn it over next. We've got Todd Youngs and Monique Bridges with us. Welcome them to kind of take center stage here at this point. And why don't we start with Todd? So Todd, if you want to go first, and then Monique, and we could maybe open it up for a few questions after your guys' initial presentation. Okay,
yeah. So hey again, everybody, members and staff of City Council and the viewing audience, wherever you might be. My name is Todd Youngs, and I'm deeply honored just to be here and to be able to share a few words with you all today. I'll start by saying, they say that looks can be deceiving. And well, the way that I look these days does not reflect at all the depths of self-destruction that made up large portions of my past. At least I hope it doesn't. In any case, I was chronically addicted to heroin and other opiates for over 20 years. I was a heavy user of intravenous cocaine and crack, as well as methamphetamines and tranquilizers. I was also severely alcoholic. I made my first trip to King County Jail in 1987 after an arrest on Capitol Hill for heroin and cocaine possession. My last arrest was in 2009 in southern Missouri, and that was for drunken destruction of property. I was a great party guest. During the 2 decades in between, I saw the inside of a jail cell at least a dozen more times, including 1 stint in prison, as well as a trip to the psych ward. Most of those confinements were in Missouri, not in Washington. I did numerous inpatient and outpatient drug treatment programs. I was on methadone maintenance 5 separate times. I was on Suboxone once and Subutex once. Those particular approaches did not work for me personally, although I do know that some people find relief through them. And so I do want to honor that. I suffered collapsed veins in my arms, my hands, and my feet with significant needle scarring on both jugulars. I was largely an unemployable head case, as I like to say. And the romantic relationships that I did have were mostly unstable and messy. I watched many close friends, people that I love, die as a result of their addictions. My sense of loss on that last point could not be overstated. So I think you're getting the picture here. It was not a pretty sight. So the good news, in case you're all wondering where my story is going, is that I celebrated 12 years of continuous sobriety this past May. That is indeed a miracle. And to put it quite simply, that change was brought about through the guided application of visionary plants, ayahuasca specifically, and the intensive 12-step oriented processing of the experiences induced by ayahuasca. Okay, so, we all know that the letter of the law does not permit the type of approach that I took, whether it was effective or not. But I do feel quite confident that the spirit of the law is pleased and satisfied that I am no longer a problem for the courts, my family, or my community, and that I am once again a joyful and contributing member of the human family. So also, I do understand that these matters are complex and from a legal point of view, but I believe that our system of laws can evolve to reflect changing realities and needs. And I believe that respectful avenues can be found for all sides to come together in a way that is mutually accommodating and mutually beneficial. I have a deep-seated conviction that a strong evidence-based educational component is vital to any possible policy changes. I think we owe it to ourselves, our families, and to our beautiful city to allow for innovative approaches to the problem of addiction to move forward without fear of prosecution or persecution. I want to thank you all again for letting me be here today and to share with you. Thanks.
Todd, thank you so much for your leadership and courage in coming here and telling your story. And I really, really appreciate you being here today and participating. And, I don't think there's anything more to add. That was very powerful, and I appreciate you stopping by here. Let's hear from Monique, and then if there's questions for Todd and Monique from other panelists, or to break it down a little bit more, we can take a moment for that before we move on. But Monique, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so my introduction to ayahuasca or plant medicine is a different avenue than everyone here, I believe. My children and I are survivors of domestic violence. And we managed to get to a safe place. We managed to get to a shelter. And then from there, my healing journey began. I started doing a lot of research and a lot of therapies to, recover from the trauma that me and my children had experienced. And my prayer is that I wanted to create a safe place for my children to live. And I want my house to be full of laughter and joy. And I knew in order for my children to grow up healthy and happy, and in order to do that, I knew I had to do my work of healing. So I did therapy, I meditated, I've done antidepressants at one point in time, gone to seminars and support groups. And I found it was beneficial and helpful and got me to a certain point. And so I wanted to take a deeper dive. So I started doing some research on other healing modalities that were out there. And I discovered, psychedelic therapies, and I started researching that. And it was so outside my scope. It was very expensive. And then, I was researching things about ayahuasca and that would involve travel. That was just way outside of what I was capable of doing. By synchronicity, I came across the Santo Daime, which is an ayahuasca church, a religious practice from Brazil that's protected by our Freedom of Rights Act. And it's, so because of that, I felt safe to participate. And I took that deep dive, and I'm so glad that I did. My children are thriving. They're older now. They, graduated from school. They volunteer in their communities. I'm like one proud mama. And yes, through my experience, I had some revelations and insights. However, through my journey of participating in the ceremonies and in the community, I received an unexpected gift. And that was like being in community and being in relation with people. And through that experience, I've been called to participate and develop the SHARP project, which is Seattle Healing and Restoration Project, where we're teaming up with other community members such as Ames Institute to provide ayahuasca ceremonies for BIPOC communities. And then also developing a program for people that are suffering from substance use disorder. We're providing housing while they're in the program, as well as integration and other services. And through my experience, I've noticed that, building a more holistic model of healing that's centered around these substances, because relationships that we build are just as healing, in my experience, as the medicines themselves. And so that's my brief share. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Does anyone on the panel have some initial questions for Monique and Todd after those great presentations about the role these substances have played in their life journey? Yeah, Tatiana?
Hi, yeah, my question is if either person would like to speak to how the community aspect with psychedelics contributed to your healing. I know Monique, you touched on it a bit, but how did that contribute? Like what role did that play in your life?
Well, what I've found for myself is after the ceremonies and things is we're all working on things. We're all having these realizations. To have being in community with someone, you have someone to witness your testimony. And then also the relationships that we build together and the support networks that we build, because we don't do this in isolation. You know, it's not just, for me, it's not just the consuming of the plant medicine. You know, because all those things like the therapies, the support groups definitely supported my experience. My meditation practice definitely supported my experience when I was in ceremony. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
I'll chime in here too, just a little bit, Tatiana. As somebody recovering from heavy addictions, reconnecting with the human family, community was absolutely vital. Because through my 20 plus years of heavy addiction, I had broken fellowship with not just myself, but my loved ones around me, and then just humanity at large. I was broken. My connection was broken. And to reconnect with that, I'm very involved in just regular recovery community, 12-step recovery community, which provides a really beautiful container. I'm also involved in spiritual communities too, that are more centered around the ceremonial use of ayahuasca, but just on the regular everyday activity of being involved with 12 steps as a process, which is an individual thing, and then the container, which is 12-step recovering communities. All of that is the framework that I was able to, step back into life. And so absolutely critical.
Yeah. Mason?
I just have a quick question. I thought about asking this to the last panelists, but I think it's good for this panel as well. Dr. Sackett had mentioned that the evidence for entheogens or psychedelics in addressing substance use conditions is a little more preliminary. The evidence is much better and more developed for things like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. But I just wanted to point out that substance use doesn't come out of nowhere, right? It's very related to depression and PTSD. And so to the extent that we can address these issues with psychedelics, I'm quite optimistic that we will be simultaneously addressing substance use conditions. And, there is some evidence out in the literature. It does exist. You can read narratives from people who have taken a single dose of psilocybin and then suddenly no longer felt a strong urge to smoke or to drink alcohol. So I'm just curious to hear, maybe Todd's perspective on that, or Dr. Sackett's.
You want to go first, Nathan, or you want me to?
You go for it, Todd. You're the expert.
The School of Hard Knocks taught me well. I would say that depression and anxiety in some cases or other conditions could be the substrate from which addiction grows, and addiction is a response to. But addiction is also, in my experience, is a primary condition which can exist without those substrates. In my case, my depression and anxiety came as a result of addiction. There are some people with whom I have worked where they had difficult formative experiences that might have, but it's always hard to say which is which. And I know, speaking from my own experience, I thought I was depressed and anxious when I got into my 20s. I was a very happy person as a teenager, but as drugs and alcohol became a center part of my life and then gradually grew into heavy addiction and alcoholism, I became depressed and anxious and a lot of other things. And I traumatized myself I put myself in dangerous circumstances. And so I was doing some serious damage to myself. But I got to say that having gotten recovery through ayahuasca and 12 steps, I'm no longer depressed. I'm pretty much the happy spaz every day of my life. I still suffer a little anxiety like we all do. But I've resolved a lot of things that might have been present in the past and things that occurred later. And so I don't know if that's an exact answer to your question, but I just wanted to give a couple, comments about that.
Yeah, I totally agree with Todd. I think the sentiment is true, though, that oftentimes substance use is, co-occurs with all kinds of other things. It doesn't occur in a vacuum, but it's hard, right? Addiction is such a complicated thing, and there's so many different phenotypes that it's not a one-size-fits-all adventure. But certainly, I think psychedelics have an important role to play in a variety of phenotypes. For the person who uses because they're depressed, certainly it seems like psychedelics could play a powerful role, or conversely, it could help with people who have primary substance use disorders and have depression as a result. I think there's a role for both. But I totally echo what Todd says.
Great. Well, to keep the agenda moving along here, that was a great exchange. I didn't want to jump in, very organic, and we learned a lot of great stuff. And I think it is a good pivot to Dr. Marks, who did just jump in that exchange to get the broader presentation from Dr. Marks. So Mason, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much. So you can tell I'm a lawyer because I often start my talks by saying that I'm just speaking in my own personal capacity. I'm not speaking for the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board or any of my employers. So getting that out of the way, I come at this from the perspective of medicine and public health. I'm a law professor, but I did train to be a doctor. And like Dr. Sackett and probably many other people on this panel, I was very frustrated by the limits of our mental health care system. The drug treatments we have are often very ineffective. They haven't changed very much in decades. Up to 2/3 of people who take an SSRI like Prozac, Paxil, Lexapro receive an inadequate benefit. And oftentimes people will take multiple drugs over the course of many months or many years and still receive no benefit or inadequate relief. So due in part to their ineffectiveness, we've seen suicide rates rising steadily for the past 20 years. We've seen drug overdoses literally skyrocket in the same time, the past 2 decades. So people want and need something new, something different, and psychedelics or entheogens do appear in many cases to fill that unmet need. They often have fewer side effects. They often act more quickly, and really impressively, and no one really understands why this is, the benefits often persist for months, sometimes 6 months or more. And the evidence suggests that they are relatively safe. And that's especially true of psilocybin. It's very non-toxic. It has a very low potential for addiction. People just don't use these substances the way they might other more addictive substances. And many prescription medications, even many over-the-counter medicines, are more addictive and more dangerous. Some psychedelics like psilocybin appear to help people overcome addictions to substances like alcohol, tobacco, and opioids, which collectively are responsible for over 500,000 deaths every year in the US. It's actually closer to 750,000 deaths. And Seattle has certainly been affected by these trends. And it's really important to note that we're talking about decriminalization here. We're not talking about legalization. We're not talking about retail sales. And we're really just advocating to not arrest people and put them in prison when they have few options and they try to help themselves. Last week, I was talking to Jesse Gould, who's a former Army Ranger, and he runs an organization called the Heroic Hearts Project. And they set up psychedelic retreats for veterans who will travel to a retreat in another country to use a psychedelic like ayahuasca. And he told me that he thought it was tragic that in America and in Seattle, people who've made such incredible sacrifices for their country are forced to either violate the law or to bear the expense and burden of traveling to another country to gain access to these substances which can help them. Decriminalization is a very sensible, evidence-based policy at this point. It's been implemented in other countries around the world and in a growing number of cities and states here in the US, including Oregon. I really commend you, Councilmember Lewis, for your leadership on this issue. Many veterans thank you, many people with cancer, substance use conditions, disabilities, and mental health conditions, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marks, and thank you for your participation here today. Can I just ask briefly too, because we've had a lot of conversations here around research, clinical trials. Seattle has the great distinction of having one of the most preeminent institutions of medical research in the world within our boundaries at the University of Washington. And one of the things you said during your presentation was, we're talking about decriminalization, not necessarily legalization or retail. How does the current state of the law in the state of Washington, and maybe this can be informed by commenting on some of your work in Oregon, right, where there's a different statewide policy, but what implications does this have for institutions like the University of Washington that might want to engage in a higher level of research and development around the potential of these substances?
Great question. So it's possible now to do that research. There are a lot of obstacles. It can be difficult, burdensome, expensive. But the Biden administration just made an announcement last week that they want to make it easier for people to study these substances. So that's encouraging. Hopefully that's the start of more positive developments to come. I do want to point out, I don't think anyone here would oppose full legalization. I also like to point out that in some places, like in the Netherlands, people can buy psilocybin and many psychedelic substances over the counter. They don't have to show any identification. And with respect to psilocybin, the Dutch Ministry of Health commissioned a public health study to determine what the risks would be of people being able to access psilocybin so easily, and concluded that the risks were negligible, the risks to public health and to individuals. So just to kind of, think about the things in perspective, but right now that's what we're advocating for is decriminalization, which just makes a lot of sense. But to answer your question, there are many opportunities to do research in Washington. It's still very difficult, but hopefully that will change soon.
Todd, did you have something to jump in on that with?
Yeah, I wanted to just I wanted to make one comment that among psychedelic substances, one that we haven't mentioned yet is Ibogaine, which there's enough preliminary data from different parts of the world that do show that Ibogaine is particularly effective with certain substance use disorders, particularly during the withdrawal stage from physically habit forming things like heroin, or in some cases even alcohol or whatnot. I think one of the challenges with Ibogaine is that it actually can be that it needs to be only really administered in a medical setting, because it can be dangerous. Even though it's an intervention that's only utilized in a punctuated way for great benefit, it does require a little bit more careful handling. And I just wanted to mention that as part of the overall conversation here, because I do have a couple of friends that actually found their recovery initially through Ibogaine and then went on to become involved in regular 12-step fellowships like I am. I just wanted to throw that in there for the record.
Thank you. Dr. Agrawal, you have something to add on to that?
Oh, yes. I just wanted to clarify something that Mason, you'd mentioned about the Dutch model of regulated access to psilocybin. I purchased mushrooms there in 2006, and I was carded. And I looked into it. I believe they do kind of crack down on underage, like sales to minors. So there's some regulatory process. The Dutch system has evolved a lot over the years, so I don't know what the latest is, but my understanding is that there was, just like their coffee shop models, where they had one of the early places in the West to sell cannabis, they had adopted some of those models when they were in the smart shops. That's what they used to call the mushroom sales. So that's just a little point of comparative geography.
Todd, did you have one more thing to add, or is your hand still up from earlier? Okay, great. Just checking. Okay. Well, let's go forward here to our last two panelists, and then let's open it up with the balance of time for some questions from the audience that we can distribute out to everybody here. So the last two folks that we're queuing up are Tatiana Quintana and John Rapp. So Tatiana, I'll let you go first, and then we'll close out with John and go to the audience questions.
Thank you, Councilmember. So my story begins a few years ago when I was gifted with the opportunity to have my first psychedelic experience. And at that time, I had no idea how profoundly this experience would impact my life. The depth of emotions that I was able to embody that day helped me to understand on a visceral level that trauma truly is stored in the body, and that unresolved trauma can often look an awful lot like someone's personality. And that was true for me. And I was awakened then to just how much potential that I truly have, and that I was being weighed down by unresolved issues from my past. With the help of an experienced therapist, I've been able to move through a lot of my issues and my trauma on my healing journey. You know, when I was growing up, I was a DARE kid, and I went to DARE camp, and I definitely drank the Kool-Aid of drug war propaganda for a long time, well into my adulthood, especially because my family has been severely impacted by the harms caused by the war, by the drug war policies more than once. And as a result of that, I definitely believed that drugs and drug use just across the board was moralistically bad. The growing body of empirical research shows that psychedelic medicines are an effective and safe treatment for issues such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD, as we've discussed earlier today. And naturally occurring psychedelics have been unjustly and wrongly labeled as dangerous and with no medical benefit, alongside a whole slew of other substances that were all lumped together in the Controlled Substances Act back in the 70s, without any scientific evidence justifying those labels. It wasn't until after I had my experience that I became skeptical of my indoctrination and realized that these mythologies perpetuated by our government about drugs are almost all completely false. I learned further of the insidious political and racist underpinnings of the war on drugs, shared most explicitly by former Nixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman in an interview in Harper's Magazine in 1994. And if you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to go and look that up on Google. What I think about the most these days, and what has most inspired me to become an advocate, is working on how I can help other people have safe access to these substances as a protected right, not just by happenstance or as a factor of their privilege. Decriminalization also leads to the creation of more organizations that focus on establishing best practices, safety standards, guidelines, and most importantly, education and educational resources for the psychedelic community and the broader community. This is all extremely important. I'm so sorry. Thank you, computer. This is all extremely important and necessary as we move forward with this kind of reform across the country. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are amongst the unalienable rights promised to every American in our Declaration of Independence. If I am truly promised these rights, such as the right to life, then I must have the right to heal and to have sovereignty over my wellness. Psychedelic plants and fungi can be utilized responsibly and sustainably by adults in community, whether that be for wellness, spiritual exploration, or other personal reasons. As long as your choice does not infringe on someone else's freedom and causes them no harm, no one should be arrested nor their livelihoods jeopardized for what they choose to do or put into their own bodies. At Decrim Nature Seattle, we are working every day to ensure that there is not only safe access, but also equity in access through our proposed legislation, which includes protecting our rights to cultivate, sustainably collect, and share these resources in our communities. Thank you.
Tatiana, thank you so much. And I still go back to think, and I don't remember if you were in the first meeting I had, but said definitely several subsequent ones in the spring that kind of set us on the road to being here today. So we just really appreciate your leadership. All right, John, you are up.
Thanks, Andrew. It's good to be here today. Thank you to you, Councilmember Lewis, to the council staff, to my fellow speakers today, and in particular to Decriminalize Nature Seattle, which has worked so hard to get to this particular moment. I'm a trial lawyer here in Seattle. I was raised in a small town in Grays Harbor County down past Olympia. My first job as a lawyer, I was a criminal prosecutor. So I've been on the other side of the drug war and seen how that can work. I then moved to a big firm here in Seattle, the biggest firm in Seattle, and eventually to the biggest firm in the world. And I've taught law school. I've not as much as Mason, but I've taught some. And I've also taught in other graduate programs. In other words, I've had a pretty mainstream career. I'm here today as a skeptic turned a major supporter of decriminalizing these plant medicines. I had no experience with these plants at all until I was in my 50s. I grew up in a conservative town and family and church. And as far as I was taught, all non-prescription drugs were a sin, even alcohol. I didn't have my first drink until I was 23 years old. We thought a drug is a drug is a drug. And I'm here today because I've changed my mind. And I hope those of you who are skeptical listening to us today will change your mind too. I now know firsthand the power, the healing power of these ancient plant medicines. Last year, just before COVID hit, I lost my only child, Nicholas, to heroin, hopelessness, and eventually suicide. He struggled for 13 years and ultimately lost his battle. Yet these plant medicines were really all that helped him much at the end. After Nick died, I wandered in grinding grief for months. I even thought of joining him in death myself. Then I decided to look into these plant medicines for myself. It was among the best decisions I've ever made in my life. With the help of a wise guide and ancient plant medicine, I've healed much grief, though it will never be all gone. Some grief just hurts, and nothing ultimately can change that. But this ancient medicine from the Amazon has replaced a major prescription medications that helped me some that had significant negative side effects. Even my psychiatrist now approves, quietly. So today I ask all of you who hear me now to join Councilmember Lewis, the City Council, the OEIR Task Force, and the many advocates here today who support decriminalization of these plant medicines. Seattle needs them as much as our peer cities who have already taken this visionary step. Like my dear lost son, the homeless and the hopeless, the suicidal in our city, the dying, the traumatized vets, and other trauma survivors, and many others you likely know, need our help now. They need your help. These plant medicines can help heal our beloved city. Thank you.
John, thank you so much for coming here and sharing today. And, I really appreciate your courage in sharing your story. And, it's always hard to, hear, but it's very brave. So thank you. Camila, can we now pivot here, having heard from all of our panelists, to open this up and ask a couple of questions, and then I'll moderate this process and sort out questions based on who wants to raise their hand and answer. But why don't we jump into that so we can get through as many as possible before folks have to leave. But I do just want to take a moment to really thank our panelists for joining today with a variety of life experience, of expertise, deep knowledge about this policy area. And I do want to reserve maybe a little bit of time at the end after we do some questions to talk about some ways that we might chart out some next steps to really go forward on some of the things we've been talking about today and what that might look like as a broader Washington State community, City of Seattle, King County, to really talk about how we can put some of these concepts into action and take some steps forward. But before we get there, Camila, let's queue up some questions.
All right, thank you, Councilmember Lewis, and to the panelists for sharing with us today. We are grateful for your strength, your courage, and your personal stories. We have several questions from the listening audience, and the first question is, how would you explain the benefits of psychedelic plants and fungi to someone who is apathetic about substance abuse disorder?
Anyone who wants to take that question on? So, but my understanding, I guess, if I could take a liberty, maybe rephrasing it a little, is the question: what are the benefits beyond the potential to assist substance addiction? Is that maybe a fair way to interpret the question?
Yes.
All right. Anyone want to jump in there? I feel like we got some good information from Dr. Agrawal earlier about a couple of potential things, but I don't know if anyone wants to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I covered in the very beginning about the benefits that entheogens substances might seem to show in palliative care, existential distress, end-of-life care. We talked about pain. We talked about these other mental health conditions were mentioned: trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression. There's been research on OCD, also clinical trials with psilocybin. There's a lot of things out there. And then I mentioned the brain injury recovery. So I think if you're apathetic about substance use disorder, there's many other maladies that it seems like having these substances are, I didn't mention in my comments, but they're also called psychoplastogens. So they have a capacity to improve the ability to make new neurons and new connections in the brain and nervous system. And that's an important common pathway in many conditions, I think, and also might also be helpful for human development.
Okay.
I would also add just really quickly that a lot of people just report feeling an enhanced sense of well-being and connectedness to other people. So, there's potential to heal relationships and just bring people together. And it's, I can understand some people might be apathetic about substance use conditions, but these are conditions that affect everyone, if not directly, indirectly, affecting healthcare costs, and someone I guarantee is affected by a substance use condition, whether you know it or not, unfortunately.
Dr. Sackett, did you have a comment as well?
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what the other panelists have said, but also just that I think the power in these substances is in the experience. That for a lot of people who struggle with depression or trauma or PTSD or substance use or OCD or a variety of other disorders, the experience for a lot of people is the feeling of numbness and the lack of connection they feel with their fellow man, themselves, their community. It's this dulled kind of emptiness that a lot of patients describe to me. And what these substances have the power to do is, in that controlled environment, they suddenly have this whole range, this whole palette of an emotional experience that they normally can't have. And that in itself, I think, is quite transformative for a lot of people. Some people may say that's spiritual. Some people say it's existential. Some people say it's just makes them feel good. But to me, that's a powerful component here, that whether you're worried about substance use disorders or not, I think the phenomenology, the experience itself is profoundly powerful. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you so much. Let's move on to the next question. Oh, sorry, Dr. Agrawal, did you have one more thing? I'm sorry.
There was one more thing that I think it's worth mentioning. There's a leader in Seattle named Anthony Back. He's a palliative care doctor, oncologist, expert in communication and mindfulness. And he's led one of the biggest palliative care centers in the country here in Seattle. And he has written several articles in our literature about his use of psilocybin to help him become a better doctor, to be a better healer, to help address whatever trauma he had so that he could be more present for his patients in difficult family meetings and pick up on the cues. So I just wanted to share this additional layer that's already being talked about. Seattle, like there's not many other doctors actually in the country that have put that kind of thing out there because of the stigma issues. But it is an important point to raise as far as those who work in healing or first responders. And he's also interested in working on a study on using psychedelics to help first responders from the COVID pandemic, and burnouts and all those terrible stresses that health workers we know have been in many other fields. So I just wanted to mention that, and I think it's an important part of could in the future become an important part of training many health professions to understand what it is from the inside, and maybe also help them become more attuned to their needs of their others. Just like Dr. Sackett was saying, the ability to connect is so critical in healthcare.
Thank you for getting that in there. Okay, Camila, let's go to the next question.
So this question was asked by two audience members, and the question is, why have psychedelics been made illegal if there is no harm in using them?
Anyone want to jump in on that question?
I can, because I spoke to it a little bit in what I said. I would like to read a quote. This is from that Harper's Magazine interview from John Ehrlichman, and I quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." End quote. I hope that answers people's questions.
If you weren't going to share that quote, I was going to. Are there any other folks that want to jump in on this question? Dr. Agrawal.
I had mentioned in my comments about the cultural history and colonialism, and I just think it's important to note some of the first contact that Native Americans in North America, indigenous people had with Western European, like Spaniards and missionaries and conquistadors and their troops. We have records from those days that show that the missionaries felt that the use of psilocybin, for example, mushrooms by some of the folks who are now living in Southwest, was a form of demonic activity and needed to be banned. So there was kind of a religious, cultural, ethnocultural war that came out of a sense of, I don't know, whatever the greed and colonialism and all those things. And so that's sort of another early point, even before Nixon's cycle of the 60s came around. This was happening in the 1600s and 1500s, and I think some of those attitudes got enshrined in prevailing Western religious institutions, and then of course our biases.
Great. I think we can move on to the next question, Camila.
Next question is, what can be done to keep access to psychedelics available to marginalized communities outside of the industrial medical industry?
I can take that one a little bit, and then if anybody else would like to jump in, please feel free to. So in the past year, I've seen a whole like a whole new flourishing of affinity spaces, essentially, for people of color, Black people, folks who have been traditionally left out of even the underground space. And so what I think our proposed legislation really speaks to is not only decriminalizing the possession, but also the non-commercial exchange, like social sharing, cultivating, sustainably cultivating and sustainably collecting psychedelics for personal use, and also in group use, or in the context of ceremony. I think that these pieces are really, really important aspects of what we're proposing, because it's going to ensure the most equitable path for people to access psychedelics going into the future. And I think both having, regulation and a medical path is extremely necessary. And I think also having a path for responsible adults to engage with psychedelics is also necessary, especially for the equity piece. This is going to be like the most accessible way financially as well for many people to access these experiences. And so that's like the part that I was speaking to earlier that really drives why I'm here, and the educational work that I'd like to continue to do into the future. And I don't know if Monique, you wanted to touch on that at all, because we do this work together, particularly.
Yeah, that's kind of like what brought me to this, and my personal experience. Because when I look out into ceremonies, there's not a lot of people of color, and I know viscerally the effects that it has made on my life and how it's trickled out down to my children. And it's really important to have spaces for people of color that is led by people of color. And then and then another reason why I wanted to be a part of DNS is to assure that that this issue is brought forward and that it doesn't get lost. Because a lot of times, especially with the legalization of marijuana, a lot of marginalized communities and people of color have suffered under the prohibition model, or the war on drugs. And then once it's legalized, they can't benefit in the profit of the legalization of marijuana, which could greatly benefit our communities, which have been decimated by families that have been harmed because of the war on drugs. So with this new renaissance that we're in, with legalizing and the road to legalizing psychedelics, I wanted to ensure that people of color have a voice and that have safe access, equitable access to this medicine if they so choose to. Yeah, and then there's research too. A lot of the research that are going into psychedelics are mostly, focused on white-bodied people, and when you're dealing within psychedelic spaces, you have to take in consideration people's culture and lived experience too, which is very important. And I'm hoping that would change. And that's another reason why I'm developing, along with Sunil and other members in our community, creating safe spaces for people of color to participate in this, because that's another thing that's keeping other than financially being able to participate in the ceremonies, is just like creating safe spaces for people too. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, guys. Let's move on to, let's try to do at least 2 more questions and then wrap up the question panel.
Okay, the next question is, what are the reasons that psychedelics are non-addictive, and is it possible for users to overdose?
Good questions.
Well, I'll jump in here. Classic psychedelics don't interact with the brain's reward system that causes dependence and addiction. Basically, without getting too technical, dopamine being a primary brain rewarder is not really, the dopaminergic systems of the brain are not that robustly responsive to classic psychedelic compounds. Obviously, there are some more hybrid psychedelic compounds that may have some activity there, but even those, it's minimal. And so in the sense of reinforcing deep pathological learning, which basically becomes addiction, there's just not the neurochemical realities that allow these substances to become problematic in the same way that cocaine, meth, heroin, alcohol can be.
Addiction, gambling, food, money, sex. I mean,
yes.
I just want to also expand that addiction frame beyond drugs.
Right, sure. Sure, so, and in terms of lethal dose, in terms of overdose, the naturally occurring psychedelic plants do not have lethal doses. Well, probably extreme amounts, yes, they might. So overdose is not typically associated with the use of psychedelic drugs. Now, is it possible that some people misuse psychedelic drugs? Well, sure. There are some sort of maybe obsessive fascinations with altered states, which is something that we occasionally see, but it's not at the same level of what we think of drugs of abuse. It doesn't have that same profile. So,
Dr. Sackett, you look like you're just jumping up and down to hop in on this one. So I'll
well,
turn.
Todd gave it an eloquent answer, exactly how I would. I will just say that when we talk about overdose, we think predominantly about opiates, right? And the opiates, the way they act on the brain is they act on the respiratory center. So they basically, their brainstem responds in such a way that they stop breathing, and that's how you overdose. Psychedelics don't work anywhere in the respiratory center. So there's really no concern about overdose from that perspective, from like a respiratory depression perspective. Similarly, like Todd alluded to, the lethal dose is for the natural occurring compounds like psilocybin is so high. I think I read somewhere it was something to the order of like 600 kilograms per mil. I mean, it's some absurd number that a human couldn't even consume, that is theorized to be a lethal dose. So the naturally occurring compounds are profoundly safe from a physiologic perspective.
Just to add, we did mention Ibogaine. There are some substances which require a little bit more attention to like cardiac, cardiovascular, electrical issues. And I think that's part of like why it's helpful to decriminalize, because people can actually seek out information. It's a little bit easier to like get advice from health professionals, so that you don't end up in any overdose or overuse for your particular health condition or need. I think that's a really important point around safety.
Thank you. Camila, so let's do the one last question and then let's wrap up the symposium.
Sure, so this last question has two parts. The first part is, do any of the panelists believe that these plants or psychedelics should be legal for general use? And the second part of the question is, how can legalizing psychedelics decrease incarceration rates? I'm sorry.
All right, I'll let panelists take that question in any order they want to.
I'll comment on the incarceration rate. Let's be looking at the data. There are actually not a lot of long-term incarcerations these days as a result of arrests for psychedelic drugs. I mean, there have been in the past. There's a kind of a de facto decriminalization of psychedelics already there, which does not preclude someone from getting into trouble and then having their life severely disrupted. Anytime we come into contact with the criminal justice system, it has a disruptive effect on our life. But I think the best benefit is if people can find healthier ways to grapple with and resolve problems that may have led to problematic behavior or true drug addiction, we're going to see a reduction in incarceration rates because people are going to get better. And you see less, in my case, I haven't been back to jail since I got sober using ayahuasca. So in that sense, and I think more broadly speaking, if these things can help, they will have the indirect effect of reducing incarceration.
Dr. Agrawal?
Dan, I was just going to mention the work of Timothy Leary. The Dr. Timothy Leary was a really renowned psychologist before he became public enemy #1. And some of his early work at Harvard as a psychologist was working on recidivism rates in incarcerated populations. This was early research, and there was still ethical issues that we don't have in place now with research on prisoners. But his work was very interesting to look and see if there was ways that using psilocybin or other psychedelic substances could help, as Todd was saying, actually reduce. And the plan was to look at recidivism rates. But then again, this research and the whole thing got shut down. But I think there was some really interesting openings there. And another interesting aside about Dr. Leary, like he invented a personality test. And when he was incarcerated due to his actions around cannabis and psychedelics, he was administered his own personality test. This is something I read when he was in jail. So he knew a lot about the psychology of incarceration. And I think there's going to be future work that we can unravel so many of the mental health issues in folks who are in prison. And then the other question was about, what was it? Incarceration and
like general like legalization and retail. Yeah, like having like basically retailers, I guess, sort of on a scheme like how cannabis is treated.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to make a comment. Like, I believe that the introduction of these substances in our culture today needs to have a joint process with across a spectrum of stakeholders, and that should include churches or religious-based organizations that also have a very important say and role in psychedelics, and to medical and public health officials, because I think it is it involves. And so, how is alcohol sold in communion on Sunday? Who's carding? What's going on? So how did we as a society develop regulations around substances that are used in spiritual settings? I think that's just something I wanted to, as opposed to like what we've done with cannabis, which hasn't involved many church organizations. I just think that's an important consideration.
Tatiana?
Yeah, thank you. I think I just wanted to speak to the second part particularly first, which I believe was, the question that addressed how we can help, how decriminalization can help in general. And I think like as an advocate working at the local level, I think it's extremely important that we don't stop with psychedelics when it comes to the harms that the war on drugs causes to people, especially people of color. The ACLU, the Drug Policy Alliance, there's a lot of really renowned organizations across the country that understand that these systems that are a part of the drug war essentially need to be broken down so that we can protect everyone, and that we don't use punitive measures to try and resolve, behavioral health issues. So as an advocate, part of what I try to do is inform people of this, and this is a progressive step. This is a small step forward in the big picture of things is what I'm trying to get at. Like, this is not where I'm going to stop, when we achieve decriminalization here in Seattle or for the state of Washington or whatever comes in the future down the line. This is a part of the broader work that we're doing. And with respect to the other question about, I guess, having access to it like cannabis, I want to echo a little bit of what Sunil touched on, in that we need we need to have the education out there. We need to have this period of decriminalization in order to create the space for people to engage with these substances safely and with information, like being informed about it. And then, years from now, I think we could get to a place where that could be possible.
Todd.
Yeah, I wanted to just echo a few things that both Tatiana and Sunil said, that I think that professional and community-based civic organizations can help to provide education and help inform people. But I have to be, and I almost prefer that some of the psychedelic plants remain almost in a more, for general use, in a more decriminalized situation, rather than to see the commercialization that happened with cannabis. I mean, I don't know, I have mixed feelings about what has happened with the cannabis industry and the large scale push to, make bucks and blah, blah, blah. And so I almost prefer the decriminalization at this stage. If you ask me tomorrow, I might change my mind, but I just don't want to see it become big business as usual, because I think it desacralizes what we're doing. Not to say that all psychedelics need to be used for spiritual reasons or personal growth. They could simply be for enlightened recreation. And there's a place for that too. Like I think Dr. Marks and maybe Nathan and Sunil said that quality of life measures can improve. So as far as recreational activities, psychedelic plants are pretty safe and generate a lot of long-term benefits for people. So anyway, that's what I had to say.
Monique?
Yeah, I just want to chime in here a bit about what the benefits of decriminalization would potentially do for the people of color community. And it would create a safe avenue for people to access, even though, there hasn't been a lot of jail for or prosecution around this area. The stigma of the war on drugs has really stigmatized our community, so they're less likely to participate. So if we were to decriminalize it, it creates a safe passage for those who feel called to do the work, be able to do that without penalty. So that's kind of like what I want to say, because it's definitely, like I said before, because I've had that protection, I was able to kind of like really relax and do my work so I can help and be present for my children and for my community, So thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you. All right, folks. Well, I think we're going to wrap up the questions now, since we're 6 minutes over when we said we would wrap it in. But, I do want to just broadly close with just a couple of general comments. I've really appreciated the discussion today. This will be recorded and posted so folks can watch and take advantage of the discourse on this symposium, even if they didn't view it live today. And I will definitely have it posted on my council website so it can be distributed and people can take advantage of it. Just to give a brief overview of council actions in this field in terms of the policy development, my colleagues and I wrote a letter in June of this year for the OEIR Overdose Innovation and Recovery Task Force to examine policy around this area and then submit recommendations. That recommendation came back and I believe has been made public, asking for broad decriminalization of these substances at the state level, and asking local jurisdictions to pursue ordinances deprioritizing enforcement in the interim of existing laws that have criminal implications for these substances. So, the council is going to continue to have this conversation. We indicated in that letter that we sent to the OEIR task force that we wanted a recommendation and would duly consider recommendations that came back with an eye toward being good civic partners in that work. And I think the symposium today was a good step forward in queuing up the next step for us as a council to talk about what some of the options might be at the local level for us to engage in policy around these substances. I think this is also a very timely discussion in the run up to the legislative session, which is going to come in starting in January of 2022 for a short session where there's some unfinished work left over from how the legislature finished the Blake decision this year in changing how simple possession laws function, criminal simple possession of drug laws function in the state of Washington. So I think that this is a good launching pad for us to continue that work on the city council that we started officially with that letter in June, and steadily has become more and more engaged, with the task force that we had, and now with the symposium. And also a good conversation for us to talk to state legislators going into the legislative session next year to talk about how we can model some of the approaches we're seeing in other states, including neighboring Oregon, and how that might inform policy decisions that we want to make here as a community to follow their lead and follow the lead of other places around the country. So, I want to leave a little space here at the end if anyone else has some final closing remarks. But I just wanted to kind of talk about some potential next steps and ways that this conversation is going to help set the table for some meaningful change. Okay, well, with that, it looks like everyone's ready to get back to their Wednesday afternoon. So everybody, please stay in touch. Really appreciate you making yourselves available this afternoon. This was a great conversation. It's going to make a huge difference. And we will be in close contact, I'm sure, on what potential next steps are as symposium members here and as a broader community. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We're out.